Welcome to The Explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled you're here today because we're about to go on a seriously fascinating intellectual journey. Today, we're doing a deep dive into how theology, history, and analytical philosophy intersect on one of the most profound and challenging questions of all time: human suffering and divine intent. We'll be looking at ancient biblical texts, the brutal realities of the antebellum South, and modern philosophical arguments to really understand the paradox of bondage and the existence of evil. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's our cognitive roadmap for today. We're going to start with the biblical slavery question, look at physical versus spiritual freedom, explore faith in antebellum America, and then tackle the massive problem of evil, wrapping up with the heaven ab initio argument. So, Section 1, the biblical slavery question, contextualizing ancient texts. Let's get right to it. We really want to neutrally examine what our theological source actually says here, which brings us to a highly charged core dilemma. Why did a perfect, all-powerful God allow slavery, or honestly, any kind of suffering to happen in these ancient texts in the first place? It's a huge question, right? And it's going to anchor our whole journey today. The theological source we're reviewing attempts to unpack this by first redefining what the text actually describes. To unpack this, the source first points to primary texts to argue that the Bible actually strictly banned kidnapping and treating humans like commodities. As this quote from Exodus 21, verse 16, clearly says, "Whoever steals a man and sells him shall be put to death." So, according to the Old Testament framework, human trafficking, capturing people and selling them as property against their will, was a crime punishable by death. So, if human trafficking was off the table, what exactly was permitted? Well, the source draws a major distinction between our modern understanding of slavery and what it calls indentured servitude. You see, in the ancient world, the socioeconomic reality was harsh. Famine and crushing debt were everywhere. So people could voluntarily contract out their labor for a set period just to pay off debts or literally just to survive. The source argues this was essentially an economic subsistence mechanism, not permanent chattel slavery. To back this up, the theological source highlights some ancient legal safeguards that were in place. For instance, if a master severely injured a servant, that servant had to be set free. They were also given time off to celebrate religious festivals and observe the Sabbath day of rest. The source uses these examples to show that this was a fundamentally different, regulated system with actual legal rights, which is obviously a sharp contrast to the permanent loss of personhood we see in modern chattel slavery. Moving on to Section 2. Physical versus spiritual freedom, the ultimate theological goal. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the specific restrictions the source claims God placed on the Israelites to prevent perpetual bondage. Servitude literally had an expiration date. An Israelite servant had to be let go after 6 years of service, or during the year of Jubilee, everyone was granted mandatory release, universally. And when they were released, masters were actually required to provide generous parting gifts to help them get back on their feet. There were even built-in welfare systems, like gleaning rights where the edges of fields were left unharvested so the poor could gather food to avoid starving or having to enter servitude in the first place. So, the source builds this argument. While we humans totally, naturally prioritize physical liberty, the biblical narrative treats our earthly physical status as strictly temporary. Instead, the ultimate theological goal is spiritual freedom. Referencing teachings from Jesus and Paul, the argument is that you can be physically free but still a slave to sin, or physically bound but spiritually completely free. In this view, God prioritizes eternal, divine liberation way above temporary physical comfort. All right, Section 3, Faith in Antebellum America, the historical paradox. But how do these ancient theological concepts actually hold up when they collide with brutal, real-world history? To ground ourselves, we just need to look at this absolutely staggering number: 3,900,000. That's the number of enslaved people in America right on the eve of the Civil War. Unlike the temporary regulated debt servitude we just talked about, this was a permanent, horrific system of chattel slavery that completely stripped individuals of their humanity. Our historical source explores an incredible paradox here. How did Christianity spread among the enslaved when slaveholders were actively trying to use a twisted gospel of submission as a tool of control? Well, the answer largely lies in the Second Great Awakening. You see, the evangelical movement really resonated with the enslaved population because it bypassed those rigid colonial doctrines. It focused heavily on personal, emotional conversion in the Holy Spirit. Plus, it allowed for highly emotive participatory worship, bringing in traditional African song and dance. Most importantly, it completely rejected that fake gospel of submission, empowering the enslaved to discover a historic Christianity that spoke directly to their spiritual and ultimate liberation. The Vanderbilt Cynicist article shares this powerful anecdote that really humanizes the struggle. Sam Johnson, who was an enslaved preacher on a South Carolina plantation, actually traded his own tea and coffee to his master's young son in exchange for reading lessons. He learned enough to read the Bible for himself. This is a brilliant illustration of how enslaved individuals actively leverage their faith. By accessing the scriptures directly, they completely rejected their oppressor's narrative and found profound spiritual freedom and dignity, despite being physically subjugated. Which brings us to Section 4, the problem of evil, zooming out to the macro question. So if earthly suffering and challenges are actually meant to build our moral character, as the theological sources suggest, we have to ask a massive philosophical question. Couldn't an all-powerful God have just skipped the suffering entirely? To answer that, classical theism often points to what's known as the soul-making theodicy. Basically, this is the theological defense that God permits evil and suffering to exist as a necessary physical arena, kind of like a training ground. The idea here is that humans literally need to face adversities in order to develop a deep, resilient, and freely chosen moral character. The philosopher John Hick captures this idea perfectly. He argues that human goodness, when it's slowly built up through personal histories of real moral effort, has immense value in the eyes of the Creator. According to this view, you can't just create someone who's instantly perfect. They kind of have to earn it by enduring and overcoming worldly suffering through this long travail of the soul-making process.
And that leads us to our final section, Section 5, the heaven ab initio argument, a philosophical rebuttal.
But what if that training ground isn't actually necessary at all? Let's walk through how contemporary philosopher Carlo Alvaro builds this into a formal logical argument. Step 1. Classical theism says God's ultimate goal is eternal bliss for free-willed creatures. Step 2, an omnibenevolent, all-loving God would obviously want to avoid unnecessary suffering. Step 3, an omnipotent God has the ability to create free beings directly in heaven or ab initio from the beginning. Step 4, horrendous earthly suffering clearly exists. Therefore, Step 5 concludes that classical theism's God does not exist, because if he did, he would have just created us in heaven from the start and entirely skipped the pain.
Now, you might be wondering, wait, if God created us directly in heaven, wouldn't we just use our free will to sin anyway? Alvaro's paper powerfully counters this by looking at the actual root of sin. Drawing on thinkers like Augustine, the paper notes that sin stems from cupidity, which is a lustful attachment to material, earthly goods. But think about it. If souls are created directly in a spiritual heaven, there are no material goods. There's no territory to fight over, no money, no physical hunger. Without those things, the motivation to sin just completely disappears. So you can still have free will, just without the environmental triggers that cause evil.
The paper then impartially concludes that while this argument is a massive challenge to classical theism, which relies on a personal God using earthly suffering for soul-making, it actually leaves plenty of room for deism. A deistic God is basically a transcendent creator who set the universe in motion but simply doesn't engage with human suffering or interact with the world. This neatly explains why the universe exists, but it also explains why earthly suffering exists without any kind of divine intervention. And that synthesizes the incredible journey we've taken today. We've looked at how ancient texts regulated servitude, how enslaved Americans found spiritual liberation amidst historic atrocities, and how modern philosophy questions the very necessity of this earthly struggle. So I'm going to leave you with this final, provocative thought to ponder. If the ultimate destination and goal is a perfect spiritual heaven, was the pain of earth ever strictly necessary? Thanks so much for joining me on The Explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.